Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 90, we sit down with Sabina Streeter, a talented artist based on the East End of Long Island. We explore her fascinating German ancestry and her formative years growing up in Munich. Sabina shares her early passion for the arts, leading to her eventual move to New York City in the 1980s, where she became immersed in the vibrant art scene. She recounts her journey to Sag Harbor, reflecting on the town's evolution and comparing it to Greenport today, while trying to address the importance of preservation and the challenges facing Long Island's East End. We also dive into her artwork, discussing her current projects and her exciting plans for the future. So I hope you enjoy episode 90 with Sabina Streeter. This episode was recorded January 24th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having me. Great pleasure and honor.
So, as with many episodes that I've uploaded so far, I'd like to just start off where you were born and raised.
Yes, very well. So I was born and raised in Munich, Germany. You can hear it by my accent, probably. And I grew up partially in the city, but also for many years in the countryside in Upper Bavaria. I went to school there in a little town, so it was both the country as well as Munich, which was was a great city in its time there.
And does your ancestry go far back into Bavaria region?
Yes, it does. It's on my father's side, on my grandmother's side. It's forever, in the Alpine region, in a little village near the Austrian-Swiss border, Oberstaufen. And I think they go as far back. I mean, we have Bibles from the 18th century. There was some clergy, I suppose. My grandfather had the local hospital. I have a great-grandfather who was an inventor, and his father had a factory of boaters, straw hats. There was somehow a straw hat factory in that region of the Alps. Then I also have some Scandinavian ancestry. No, that I really cannot find out. I just know it. And it also, my family was also extremely tall for that region of Bavaria. People are not that long as we were. And on my maternal side, it's southern Germany, also Baden-Baden on the French border. So pretty much, very, not a terribly interesting ancestry in that sense. Yeah.
Do you know what your grandparents did on both sides?
Yeah, on both sides, they were inventors. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather invented the patent for a particular chain. In German, it's called eine Fuchsschwanzkette. It's a chain where you fasten your pocket watch to the pants. And he patented that and had factories. But then, of course, that wasn't so lucrative anymore when people had wrist watches. And then my grandfather, who was quite eccentric, he moved to Italy, to Milan, and he forgot to renew the patent. So they had to go back to Germany during World War I. But my aunts are all born in Italy, so that was a little bit sort of a wild card. And then there were also farmers, of course, when you go further back, when you're into the rural area. One part of my family was Protestant, the other was Catholic, which still played a big role until, I would say, the turn of the last century.
And did you get to meet your grandparents?
Oh yes. Not the grandfathers. They died earlier. But my maternal grandmother was very intellectual. She was a socialist. She was a early feminist. She had a terrible time under the Nazis. She was basically a red. And my paternal grandmother was very religious because she sort of lived in a small alpine village, and I went to endless church services with her. so because she thought my freewheeling parents weren't doing a good enough religious education. And when I was a little girl, I kind of appreciated the whole, the whole mysticism, and which was the masses were still Latin. But I never became religious.
And would they have been involved in World War One?
Well, yeah, World War One, World War Two, and No, there were terrible stories on both sides, but I can't get it. That would be a whole nother podcast.
And then, so what about your parents?
So my parents were my father, who married relatively late in life, was an architect, and he was trained by one of the last Bauhaus disciples, Professor Vorhölzer, who was part of the School of International Style, sort of in the spirit of Corbusier. And he had a terrible time, again, under the Nazis. Basically, he couldn't practice anymore because he was considered also a communist, but my father studied with him. And then after the war in Munich, which was quite destroyed, he and his cousin, who was Swiss, they were both young architects, and of course they had an incredibly, what could I say, lucrative, they had a lot of chances to build, so they built hotels and movie theaters, also some apartment buildings, and so it was a very established architectural firm. And what was great for me was that I could hang out in the studios and just sit on these big old drafting tables with white paper and use the ink and the paper and the pencils, and because my father and my uncle both decided I have some talent, so just let it do her thing. So I love that. So I basically grew up with, and my father took me a lot to construction sites as well. So weekends we did excursions all around the countryside. It was always the same. We would see a Baroque church or a medieval church or and then I was rewarded next door in a brewery with sausage and lemonade. So it was a ritual. So I had a pretty early not indoctrination, but I was very familiar with architecture.
And you said he worked with someone from the Bauhaus? No,
his professor was Vorhölzer, but there were many. My father was very devoted to modernism and the international style. However, he had a deep affinity for the vernacular alpine styles growing up on the West Bavarian mountain in an alpine village. And so he and my uncle proceeded, was in the 60s when they knew about villages who were, sort of old buildings were falling apart or were taken down. They tried to restore them. And some of them are still standing. And so he was, in that way, he was a preservationist. He both, when it came to...
So he still had where he liked the international...
When he was building in the city, it was very modernist, but simultaneously he tried to preserve the old farmhouses as far as he could, and so did my uncle. Unfortunately, most of them were eventually, when my uncle died, were taken down or dismantled or ended up in a Heimat museum.
Oh.
Yeah. I remember they were all called palaces somehow, and one was called the Crystal Palace. And it was very magic. It had a big sweeping staircase, and it had sort of a second floor, and CinemaScope was just starting, and I always had free tickets, and I could take my little friends there. So it was village. None of them survived. They're all supermarkets or taken down, sadly. But
those movie theaters.
Movie theaters, yes. So, but this was the heydays of cinema.
And then what about this is going back in time with the German expressionist films from the early 19...
Oh, you're talking about Mono and Fritz Lang and...
Fritz Lang,
that would have been his childhood.
That would have been his
No, that would be... But he loved them. He was a complete movie devotee. These were still shot in Berlin. That was an earlier date. He saw them. I mean, in their time. He was born in 1910, so he saw them definitely. So, and then my mother was a documentary filmmaker.
Wow.
Yes, she did. She started that. She was always involved with TV because she had certain shows on books, or I mean, it was all in the early stage. She did children's movies. Well, I had to work on as an extra. I was not very talented in front of the camera, so I was always relegated to being an extra. And then she had access to, through friends, she had access to the descendants of 19th century painters, such Franz von Stuck, Lehmbach, Kaubach, Böcklin, and she did interviews. She did films about these painters, and also interviews with their descendants, the widows, or even the children. Later on, also one about Louis Corinth and Beckmann, whose widow lived in New York, and Louis Corinth's daughter lived in Manhattan as well. And these films were sort of it was like the German version of NPR, Bayerische Rundfunk. They were broadcast. They're also in their property. They always were 45 minutes long, not longer. And she had sort of a formula, and they were very simple, but very atmospheric, very beautifully done. And I'm working now with a very talented woman from the Sag Harbor Cinema to restore some, and I hope that I can perhaps screen them privately. But they would have to be dubbed because they're in Germany, and always subtitled. Subtitled would be sufficient.
And are they available in Germany, or do you have...
Sometimes they do reruns, which somebody just told me there was a rerun of one, but I can't, I have copies of most of them, not very good copies, but I have some material to work with. And then she also did very interesting interviews with the whole expat community in Pacific Palisades, with Martha Feuchtwanger, the widow of Lionel Feuchtwanger, Arnold Schönberg, that whole group, Douglas Sirks. So what happened then, she was in a terrible car accident in 1988 in which my stepfather, my parents separated, died. And after that, she didn't do any more movies. She didn't have the energy anymore. So, and that's my mother.
Yes.
So my parents divorced when I was 12, and my mother remarried. The writer Oliver Hassenkamp was my stepfather, who was really highly acclaimed as a writer. He started out as a comedian. It was sort of one of the first cabarets also in post-war Munich, and extremely successful. He was on stage for about 10 years, and then started to write scripts and plays and books, and he was acting in movies. He was all over here. He was pretty well known. And he was half American. His mother was American,
Mm.
of German descent, but so he was bilingual. But later on, he was very successful with a series of children's books, which were a mix between Hardy Boys and Harry Potter.
Mm.
And wonderfully, to our surprise, they were turned into 2 feature films in Germany in 2016.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Burg Schreckenstein and books. They're not on Netflix, unfortunately. I have to talk to the producer and see if they can actually have a rerun. So, but he had a very big following of these. So there was, pretty much every second boy who grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s read those books. So, but sadly, there was this car crash. He died in it, and so they're no more available. There's no more writing.
Oh, but that was in Germany.
That was in Germany. That was in Bavaria. It was that was a fatal accident. It was in Bavaria.
And then just because you said you weren't interested in the conceptual, and it's interesting because you grew up with your dad. He was interested more in modernism and.
My father, in a way, was more modernistic than I was, and I certainly did not love mid-century modern architecture at all.
And that was all the rage at that time.
It still is the rage. It still is the rage. It still is the rage again. And it's a funny story. My father was so adamant, and I like Baroque and opulent and gold and purple and kitsch. And so whenever we went to my grandmother's place in the Alps, we passed Neuschwanstein, King Ludwig's castle, the Disney castle.
Yes.
So we were like, can we go? We don't. I thought, nope, we can't. I said, why can't we go? Nope. We look now at the early Romanesque church, and then so it went on for a long time. And then one time, on the way back to Munich, he just caved in and he said, okay, we go. You can look at your kitsch castle, but I'm not getting out of the car. You just go by yourself. I was maybe 10. And he said, stayed in his car. And I walked up the stairs, and there were no tourists. There were absolutely no tourists. And I walked around, and it was just, oh my God, and the knights and the murals and the princesses and the swans and the gilding and the stars. And I was just in heaven, literally. And the marble and the opulence, and so I'm stumbling around there totally alone. And then all of a sudden a guard comes up to me and says, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm here to look at the... And he said, yeah, where are your parents? And I said, well, my father is downstairs in the car, but he said he's not going to come up. He's not going to look at that kitsch, and I should look at it myself. God just took me by the hand. I said, I'm going to have a word with your father. He took me down. So I said, how can you let this little girl go alone? But I didn't pay entrance either. Nobody stopped me.
Yeah.
So, you're neglecting your fatherly duties or something. And so at least I got to see it all on my own without anybody.
Wow.
Right.
And just to go back a little bit, I'm curious what you kind of did for fun as a kid growing up in
Bavaria. Drawing. Drawing. And then I was always, there were farms around us. We had later, when my parents divorced, I grew up partially in a tiny farmhouse, which we shared. It was owned by an artist friend of ours who also was breeding ponies, you could say. It was sort of the archaic mountain pony, which you have in the Alps, in Der Haflinger, with those big wide manes. And so I got deeply involved. I was working in the stable, or I was in the stables, or I was dealing with getting in the hay. I basically worked a lot manually, because if I wanted to go riding, I had to mark the stables. So it was riding and being around the animals and drawing. And that was my fun.
You didn't, and you said you grew up a little bit more outside of the city.
That was, after when my parents divorced me, we basically moved out, and I went to that country school, but then I got, and then it was the boarding school. So, and in vacations you were in the countryside in Bavaria. We swam in lakes, and we had bicycles, and we didn't travel. I was 19 years old when I went with my mother to see Venice the first time. And it was a very simple country childhood, and you had to help a lot.
And then now going back to where you were at boarding school, were your parents okay with you going away to art school at the boarding school?
No, the boarding school was finished then. And I went to Munich and I just enrolled in art school. I didn't even ask. I just went there and I said, and I had a portfolio because I had so much already, and I just submitted it. And then I told my mother, I'm going now to this, and then I left home basically and had my own apartment. Which was I was so fortunate. It was still inexpensive, and I had roommates, and then I was in that art school for years. So, coming back to Munich and generally southern Germany. I mean, Munich was the secret capital of Germany. It was a truly magic place because Berlin was divided, and then you had Bonn, which was more, I would say, like Washington. That's where the embassies were and all that, but it was a relatively small place, and there was a lot of industry around it. And Munich there were thousands of American troops. I mean, there was a whole American life. So there were PXs, there were incredible clubs. Well, you had all the big performers coming. Elvis was stationed there, but you had from Ella Fitzgerald to Louis Armstrong. You had just an incredible influx of entertainers, and the States poured a lot of. I mean, they were so interested in investing into Germany as the rebuilding of Germany. The West wanted to rebuild it as a bulwark, against the East. I mean, the Russian border was the East German border was very close. Yeah. So the Bavarian film, Bavaria, they were called, the film studios were built up. That was all money from the States. Movies were shot. So it was an incredibly well-financed artistic period. And then, of course, you had also the new German filmmakers. You had Fassbinder, you had Herzog, you had Wim Wenders, you had Schlöndorff. I mean, you had all that in
Was that going on in
Munich? That was a real, when I grew up, that was pretty much, there were on every corner was a film shot. Everybody was involved. Either you were the assistant, or I was involved. You were an extra. You knew the soundman of Wim Wenders who needed for 2 days. And it was really, it was fascinating. There were clubs and restaurants where only that film scene was, and also, of course, there were big rivalries and all that. But it was truly a great time. And you had the music scene, which was also Giorgio Moroder, who wrote Love to Love You Baby with Donna Summer. He opened the first state-of-the-art electronic recording studio in Munich. And then all of a sudden, all the big bands came to record. All of a sudden, the Stones were there, and Alice Cooper, and David Bowie, and Brian Ferry, and they recorded there. They stayed sometimes for weeks in Munich, and you would see them. And there was also a smattering of CIA, for sure. There were spies.
You could tell.
We had nicknames, yes. There were in certain, you would always hang out in these Wirtschaften, I don't know, what would you call them, brewery houses or taverns, and there were always, you see the guy back there, that's a spy. But I fabricated, added to the allure.
Yeah.
Then there was fashion. Of course, you had the big industries, car industries, all that. So
BMW and
all that, I mean, which I certainly wasn't involved with. But in terms of arts and theater, it became great, and it was experimental, and it was a fantastic time, which came a bit to a standstill in the 90s because Berlin opened, and then Berlin became the capital. And there was always such a rivalry between Munich and Berlin. But most of my artistic friends who were involved in media or in the art, they all moved to Berlin.
Why do you think that was?
Well, because you had more possibilities. Then all of a sudden it opened up. Munich became very expensive. And all of a sudden there was, Berlin in 89, 90. I mean, possibilities were endless. They reopened the UFA film studios.
Just more opportunity.
Much more opportunity, yeah. By far more opportunity.
And then, Munich became more expensive and Berlin was cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah, because nowadays I think of Berlin more as the arts.
Yes, for sure.
But it's interesting hearing before.
No, there was a golden time in Munich, and it was, of course, I mean, the north. We have this big north-south thing, and they always look down on us. It's sort of provincial. So, but it was golden years in Munich, and so you had a radio station, American Forces Network, and you had Radio Free Europe, and that was the cultural warfare of the West towards the East. So we listened 24/7 to AFN. So we were steeped in American music and rock and roll. So we had the Radio Free Europe had more European rock and roll. They had the French rock stars and all that, and AFN had. And I thought everybody listens to AFN, the whole world. I didn't realize that it was a particularly Southern German thing. So when I had an American friend visiting years later, and I have a radio station on, he said, "Can you just stop playing this military station all the time?" Because, of course, there were also news, and then you had phrase of the day for GIs to learn German. So it was, "Ich möchte ein Bier, I want a beer," or something. And I said, "Why don't you listen to it? Do you listen to FM in New York?" "No. Of course not. We don't have American Forces Network." So we were raised on American film and pop culture.
I see that I think there was a push for that even I think it's talked about a lot in Berlin with the West having a real influence of American, I don't know if they would even say American propaganda compared to, because they were pushing all this music and magazines and other stuff, but you had it in Munich too, and other parts of Germany.
Well, we had it explicitly in Munich because we had the soldiers, we had the bases, we had an enormous base outside of Munich, where it was its own world. I mean, I have friends who grew up in their fathers were high-ranking militaries, and they didn't even quite realize there was a whole other world outside. They had their own cinemas. They had there's a great movie, Buffalo Soldiers, which describes that pretty well. That was the base, I think, in Kaiserslautern. Had a big fashion scene also, and if you were tall and relatively thin, you didn't have to be fantastically beautiful at all. You worked for fashion companies and did a little bit of runway work. Usually they stuck me. It was great pocket money, and usually they stuck me in a skiing outfit or big bulky sweaters because I was so tall. And so the Italian designer, Roberto Cavalli, he needed a model, so he hired me. And after 2 days, he kind of fired me. He said, "You're the worst model I ever had. You walk like a cowboy and you're much too clumsy. Can you do something else?" And I was totally crushed. And he was very nice. He said, "I hope you have other talents. You're not going to make it." And I said, "Well, I can draw." And he said, "Oh, you can? Well, let's see." So I bring you your portfolio. So I came back the next day with my portfolio, and he hired me on the spot. And he said, you can work for me in Florence after Christmas. And so I ended up in Florence without speaking a word of Italian, absolutely none. And started to work for Roberto Cavalli, who was at the time not the huge Cavalli he is now. It was sort of more of a very expensive, but very handmade, sort of a rich hippie look. And it was fascinating. I mean, it was very glamorous and was Machiavellian also. And I lasted a year and a half, learned Italian.
Wow. And how was it?
Phonetically.
Yes.
I can't speak it properly still, but I can get by, so to speak. Yeah.
And how was it living there for that year? Did it feel like you could connect with the people in Florence, or
no? Well, yeah. I stayed with a wonderful couple, and her father was a German movie star and a friend of my stepfather. So I basically was under their wing, and of course would speak German with her always. And they took me along once in a while, and I got to go to very grand houses and all that. But there was nobody really around my age. Most of they were studying abroad, or they were. It was Florence is a very closed, or was then. It wasn't very international, and I was really a little bit too young to immerse myself into the history and culture. I mean, it's incredible. Now I've been going back a lot and appreciate it much more. But I mean, in those days, it was wasted on me for sure. And also, I had to work so hard. I could barely, and with the double pressure of not speaking the language, it was intense. But I mean, I have a great love for the language. And also, Italy then was chaotic. For sure. There was also Brigate Rosse. There were the assassinations, the abductions. There was constantly Sciopero, strikes. A lot of times the museums were closed. Well, I decided to go back to art school. Not for a credit, because I had my credits already, but so to speak, just enroll without credits to have it less expensive. And I was hired by a company to do some advertising in New York. I had friends already in New York. So I enrolled in Parsons. But the moment I arrived in New York, there were so many. I mean, there were people from France, from Italy, from England. There was we were unkindly called Eurotrash. But that was really the scene. So it was wonderful. And I started to work pretty immediately again for this advertising at Madison Avenue. It was sort of the end of the Madman area, so I did a lot of storyboards and but what happened then we're in the 80s, and there was always tech nipping on the heels of. There was illustration got supplanted with photography, then you had the computers came, you had cut, you had in theater. I was also involved in theatrical painting, but the projections came up. So for a while I went retrograde and learned how to do Venetian stucco and fresco and murals, and I did that for interior designers for years.
Wow.
Yeah, anything but a computer. I absolutely refused to sit in front of a computer.
Just was tired of that part of it, because that was...
It just, the work dried up. It just did. You had to read, or you had to learn how to use a CAD or something. It just, you had to reinvent yourself. And parallel to that, I started to do my independent artwork, because by that time I met my ex-husband. We lived in Soho. We had a nice loft, and I could work large. And having done theater, I was pretty comfortable with large scale, so I did large scale sketches of and I had a little show at PS1, and so my independent artwork started to pick up. And then, of course, the New York 80s scene was incredible, art scene.
But how long were you at Parsons?
Not that long.
Not that long.
Because I started to work again.
Yes.
So it was like, and I took courses here and there, but I never found that. I went then to, there was an interesting school. It was by a former set designer for Broadway, and it really taught you scenic painting and set design and lighting design so that you would be able to do the union exam. So I learned tremendously. And then at one point, the thing is, when you do theatrical painting, you work with very toxic materials. And I was pregnant with my daughter and all of a sudden realized I can't do this. This is really dangerous.
Yes.
Pigments and aniline dyes.
And they weren't really, at that time, they didn't really, people weren't saying, oh, you shouldn't do this. It was kind of, people just did that.
Just did it and had cancer. Yeah, it's like, you should wear a mask or something. It wasn't like now. People were much less aware of all that. And then I still worked and lived in the city for a couple of years and started to come out to the East End. I mean, I knew it from all the years living in New York. We had spent already a summer in Greenport.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at the breezy shores, at the little cottages, which was heavenly. And then in August in Orient, by the water, you could rent a cottage.
This was in the 90s?
91. My daughter learned to swim there, so it must have been 93 or 94. Something like that.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and then I loved it here. I loved it. But Alex, father of my daughter, said, no, let's check out Sag Harbor. He had several arguments, which were absolutely right. And then we got our old house in Sag Harbor. And then my daughter Lily went to school in New York for a couple of years. And then I think by second grade, she moved into Pearson Elementary. So she's pretty much raised in Sag Harbor, but bilingual.
And just to go back a bit, I was wondering because you said you were living in Soho at the time, and that was in the 80s.
Gentrification galore.
It was starting. Even I guess it's probably started in the 70s, but 80s was.
I was there my first winter in 80. It was 81, 82. You still had. It was a mix. It was just you still had a couple of Broome Street Bar. You had the, Alex had a store on Princeton's Broadway. His rent was $200. You had crime, mind you. Food restaurant was still there. Finelli's, of course, my lady. All the old haunts. You had the galleries, the big galleries. You had Paula Cooper, Castelli, the 420 building. You had, it was a great mix. It was the heydays. It was fantastic. And then it changed rapidly by the mid-end 80s. And then the galleries moved to Chelsea.
And then it kept...
It was sort of a detour. It was Soho, but then a lot of them went to the East Village. From the East Village, they went back to Soho, but then moved to Chelsea. And that changed a lot. And when the galleries left, the chain stores came in. And then all of a sudden, if I walk around there, I feel like Rip Van Winkle, Ghost from Christmas Past. I can't even find the entrance to my old building. Then they started to sell the roof rights, building up. I mean, when we lived there, you still needed that medal from the city that you were a working artist to live in a loft. That's why lofts were relatively reasonable, and then all of a sudden that was dropped, that disappeared.
What do you think kind of, I mean, I know that it's kind of, not that it's just joked about, but usually the gentrification follows the artist.
Yeah, inevitably.
And just like with Chelsea and then that to Brooklyn. And
absolutely. Same, always.
But do you think that was spurred on by anything with the city at the time, or it's just, no, we're moving in? Because some people had moved out of New York City, and with the migration and in the 50s and 60s, and I guess a lot of that was empty.
You had empty spaces.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, let me backpedal that. I co-curated a show with PS1 in 87, 88. Grand Central Station, there were so many empty storefronts. It was so dilapidated that they gave these empty stores to artists to occupy, to re-gentrify. There was artists were always used to
as something
to attract. I mean, that's an old real estate playbook.
Mm-hmm.
Also, we need space, or artists used to. I mean, that has changed, but used to need space, big studios. So you automatically gravitate to industrial spaces or the countryside. Now, I think the days of the artists who produce large-scale works are probably over. That's a whole different. But I mean, look in the 50s, the expressionists moving out to the East End.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting cycle.
It's an interesting, almost inevitable cycle, but I think it was also gradual, and I don't think there's anything anymore. But
that's
gradual. If place the realtors, developers just swoop in.
Mm-hmm. And then you said you had a show at PS1.
I had several shows at PS1. The Clock Tower. Yeah.
What kind of artwork were you working on at that time?
They're hard to describe. Large scale drawings, very cartoon-like. You would say today there were memes. I might have a show coming up with the same subject matter. Again, I mean, you can see it's hard to describe it. I can't describe it. But there were also group shows. Also, institutions like PS1 were so experimental and were so incredibly. There were no restrictions. I mean, the things we did up on the roof and in the today it wouldn't have none of that.
It has so many hurdles.
Many hurdles, and also with the curatorial content and the Grand Central show was it was crazy because I invited other artists, and basically the criteria was that you can deal with it because it was dangerous. It really was. And I had a space now, the J. Crew moved into it, and right under the bridge, the Panam building used to be there. And I remember I was in Munich, and I called up people and said, have you seen it? And shortly after it opened, I had to go to Munich. And I said, yeah, we've seen it. We can't see anything. The shutters are down. You can only see. So I called, it was the MTA, and complained. And I said, yeah, sorry, we have to keep it down because somebody shot at one of your sculptures. I had some sculptures in there. There's a bullet hole in there. So, that pretty much was there I think the thing was up for half a year.
Wow.
It was called Grand Windows in Grand Central Station. Yeah.
And then while you're in New York City, did you ever think about that you ever wanted to go back to
very
Munich?
Much. Yes, not necessarily Munich, but back to Europe or England or anyway. No, I was, because there was a period and I had a small child, and I didn't really have the grit to and also the school system. I didn't quite understand it, why you have to be in this system, not the other. So anyway, we had our old house in Sag Harbor, and I moved out more or less. Yeah, in 98, I think. Yeah.
But you said at the time you had been visiting the North Fork in the Hamptons when you were deciding on coming out here, but you were you liked it on the North Fork. Or you liked Greenport, but then you ended up deciding on Sag Harbor.
I like Greenport a lot, and I really loved Orient. I really loved Orient, but I had to think about schools already, and I don't think that then the school would have been Greenport, and that was quite a ways. And the other deciding factor was, and that's why the South Fork is what it is, it's the ocean. I really love the ocean. Not that I go there often, of course. Once you live there, you don't. But it's fine. It's like already 5 miles away, and that was a big deciding factor. And the ocean is the beauty, and it's also its detriment. That's why.
And was there anything else that attracted you to Sag Harbor over other towns on the South Fork?
I always liked Sag Harbor. I always loved it. It was hands down. I wanted an old house, and it was still old Sag Harbor. There was the old Paradise coffee shop. There was the Zen existed. It was a tiny Japanese restaurant. It was the old cinema. I just loved it. I loved the American Hotel. There was just everything there.
And it was kind of a way.
And I did have friends in the other towns, of course, but I mean, it was always just, 10-minute drive, then a 10-minute drive.
Yes.
And I had friends in Sag Harbor. There was quite a contingent of also old world. So got much more into oils, and I love to paint outside. I have friends that go outside and we paint plein air, and that is without any agenda, no show, don't have to say no commission, just paint, and it's very hard. I love doing that, and I do commissions, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm right now working on 4 different ones.
Wow.
Also dogs. Working on poodles right now. And
then you've also had a lot of exhibitions.
Yes.
What were your exhibitions? Some of the exhibitions you would like to discuss about subject matter?
So, I've done exhibitions in New York and also in Berlin and Munich, with thematically themed on basically movies still. It's very influenced by 50s, 60s movies, because this was all such a big part of my life. And again, charcoal on paper. And out of these, it was about 4 shows. I just recently had one at the Sag Harbor Cinema. It was based on the movies of Douglas Sirk, and we had screenings of all the Sirk films. And they have a big exhibition room upstairs, and I had my artwork there. And parallel to that, I did exhibitions on the maritime history of Sag Harbor, also Stonington, Connecticut.
Yes.
And also on the Eastville, history of Eastville and Sag Harbor. And it was historical portraits of course, whaling captains, but also the unsung heroes of the whaling industry, the harpooners and the cabin boys and the sister sailors that were the women who went to sea with their mostly captain husbands, the doctors, sailmakers, and I did 3 consecutive shows. One was called Captains, Maids, and Widows. One was Sister Sailors and Sons of Sag Harbor. Eastville was called Age of Allure, and the Staunton, I forgot what it was called. But anyway, there were about 60 or 70 portraits. And wonderful librarian who worked here at the Greenport Library, Dahima Lyons, invited me to do a similar show for Greenport. And at that time, I had already a book made, a self-published book of all these portraits. And then I met Sally Grant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how
the exhibition
came in.
Barton Harbor Preservation, Not Speculation.
Right.
With all the exhibitions you've had previously, do you have a favorite among
all the shows? That's difficult.
That's difficult.
Well, interesting was I was invited by the creative director of Barney's at the time, Simon Doonan, to have my cinema-based, so to say, like photo roman, in the windows of Barney's in New York. And it was just a 1 week, but there I had all the windows of Barney's, and then it was quite popular, and it moved from Barney's to New York to Barney's LA, Chicago, and then it was picked up in Berlin by another big store. So all of a sudden I had these large windows. So, I mean, it was very surreal. It was a show. And of course, you always like your last show. I very much liked the show Tarnished Angels with the Sag Harbor movie cinema, because it was, which I showed a version of before in Munich at a lovely gallery in Munich, Capilovas. But in the Sag Harbor cinema, it really had a home because it was accompanied by the screening of the magnificent films of Douglas Sirk.
And for a project like that, how did that come about? Because your love for Douglas Sirk films and then the collaboration with the theater, but just how you came about with creating your artwork.
Why Douglas? I knew him. He was a friend of my parents. So I knew him and his wife quite well because he was a lot in Munich. He worked together with Fassbinder, so there was a whole history behind it, which was kind of that why I did the first show.
Yes.
No, it was for Berlin during the film festival, and then it moved to Munich, and then it came to Sag Harbor Cinema. And I think April Gornick saw it online or on Centra Images, and she said, you have to meet our Sag Harbor Cinema curator, Julia Danielo, and then it became that story. Yeah.
So now, with the recent exhibition at Floyd Memorial Library called Port and Harbor Preservation, Not Speculation, how did that project come about?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, Dahima Lyons knew my previous work of historical portraits or portraits of history, you name it, and she said this would be wonderful for the library, and we have a art curator now, and you have to meet. So it was a lot of back and forth, and then I finally met Sally, and Sally said, wonderful, and when can you do this, and can you do it? We had sort of a time, and then the Cirque exhibition came up. So I said, I think I have to push it back a little bit, because you have to do this first, and then so basically a year passed. And within this year, I changed concept 180 degree, because as much as I like the maritime history of Greenport or also some historical figures, I did a lot of research. I was thinking of Southwood and Orient and Holt. I had a lot of notes, but parallel to that, in Sag Harbor, the development had accelerated at such a speed. I had next door to me a small workers' cottage was turn of the century, was taken down, was left to the elements until it dilapidated. I still have a construction site. It's all over Sag Harbor. And that's when my alarm bells went off. And I walked and drove a lot in Greenport, and I knew it from also 25 years ago, almost 30 years ago. And I thought, my God, this might happen here just as well. Don't let that happen. I almost conceived it as a cautious warning from one maritime village to another, because they always have been compared a little bit, to heed the beginnings. So the landlords took over, or other. I mean, the rents are so high now, people are leaving. So that's, what can happen It's beyond gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
So, particularly in that period after COVID, the development of 18th and 19th centuries, and it's not development, it's basically gutting it. What's being done is the facade is being kept and the rest is just completely gutted. I showed an example in the panel we had, and it's also in the press, and then there are big additions being added on. The properties are small, most of them are less than half an acre. Pools are being squeezed in. It is basically, I saw at least 15 houses in the past 2-3 years destroyed in that manner. There's no protection for interiors. And Sag Harbor is in a way an industry town. It all revolves around real estate. You have the brokers, you have even the artists. I mean, people profit highly, the village profits highly. But a solution must be made that it is so easy to erase this whole past. When I look at this book here, Keeping Time in Sag Harbor, which Stephen Longmire put so lovingly together, I would say 40% are gone. When the exhibition here was supposed to be based only on portraiture, I suggested that it should be more focused about the history of buildings and the pressure on these two comparable maritime villages. So the show Port and Harbor, preservation, not speculation, is really a comparison between these two villages and how to deal with the pressure of modern demands and consumerism. And I wove in some figurative portraits based on historic figures, like the painting of the niece of Grace Floyd, who gave the library to Greenport. Claudio, who came on a whaler and opened that saloon in, I think, the 1860s or 70s. Sarah Adams, the suffragette, and I just learned she was a temperance movement. She was a teetotaler and gave the auditorium as a theatre and opera house. And Margaret Ireland of the Sterling. So these portraits are there, these historical portraits, but in combination also with the perils of overdevelopment. And so you find the portrait of Sarah Adams next to a dumpster or a caterpillar in order to signal the destruction that's going on, at least so far in Sag Harbor.
So that was kind of your influence for really getting that
message out, because I've been I've followed it so much. I've been to so many meetings. They're incredible. There's many movements, people who are much more eloquent than me. There's Jane Merrick of Built in Kind, who's a fantastic activist. She has a wonderful Instagram called Built in Kind. There are many environmental groups dealing with what's going on with the clear cutting from the overbuilding, the landscaping, the suburban landscaping that becomes omnipresent. But I am not a writer and I'm not a photojournalist. I can just paint and draw, and I thought this is my way of putting out the awareness. And if I can rescue some old buildings with that way, I know it's an enormous subject matter. There are so many issues, from affordable housing to the environmental impact to the also the property right. It's enormous.
And so you said that some properties are just being totally taken down,
many. Yeah. Basically the way what happens now is that the zoning codes, the CBA, and also the Architecture Review Board. First of all, it's volunteers. I think there is just not enough of them. And there are so many loopholes which people didn't used to exploit just because you could. Didn't mean you should build that large. There are so many, now people are digging into the ground. All of a sudden you have all these basements, which are actually almost like first floors. It's endless. When I came to Sag Harbor, you couldn't have a pool. You were in the historic village, no pool, end of story.
Mm-hmm.
Pools everywhere. And, the earth goes somewhere. This is, we're on an island. It's a sandy island. It's a known factor that we have flooding zones. When, the storms took off that Saturday when we had the panel, and see what happened in Montauk. I don't have a recipe. I don't, but we're fighting right now big development, anteportas in Sag Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
And that is people with very deep pockets, strong lawyers.
There's not a zone for an historic.
Yes, we have a historic village. The destruction of these houses was all the historic village. There's no protection for the interior. There's just a protection for the footprint, for the size, but you can have so and so many variances. And
so
people, they want the quaintness of the village, but they don't want to live quaint. They want their large footprint. They want the proximity to the village and to the schools and what have you. But they want to have it the way it's sort of, you have a shoe size 10, you squeeze yourself in a size 6. It's sort of an architectural Cinderella complex. If you really need all that space and all that, you shouldn't be in a small historical village. There are many options in a way.
And since you've been in Sag Harbor, has this been something that you've noticed even in the last 20 years too, starting like it's kind of gone on to another level now?
It was gradually, but I remember when the first truly historical Captain Haven's house was taken apart, and then the next one, and I was familiar with I was always deeply interested in history, so I read every history I familiarized myself with the names and the families. I was just like, where are all these ghosts going? Big fan of the local ghost tour. So that's how the Captain's Maids and Widows exhibition came to pass. It was sort of a remembrance of these. Some images were based on photographs I had, and some were sort of out of my imagination. So that was around 2014 when a lot of it. There was also the Boulevard factory was being built. Mixed success. All the surrounding houses were suffering tremendously when they put the steel in, the vibration, all that. With every major construction, you have so much side effects.
And they're not doing the work to make sure the surrounding area is also being protected when they are building.
Well, if you, as a neighbor, in my case, I insisted on retaining walls, but I had to fight for it. When I fought for it, probably half of my house just with the next rain caved under. No, the neighbor, it's also, you have construction for almost a year, starting at 8 a.m., stopping at 6 p.m. There's, you have the trucks, you have the it's for us, and we're taxpayers too, and we live year round. It is incredibly stressful.
And do you think, in terms of preservation and just people coming in that haven't lived here a while, do you think there is somewhat of a lack of respect for the past, or in terms of preserving?
I would think utterly, yes. I haven't, no.
If they had the choice, they would probably just knock it down and build something brand new.
I'm just saying that. But when I came, there were still a lot of idealists, sort of like we were, or which you have in Greenport, Charlie, who is restoring the Samuel Phillips house, somebody like that. There were still people around. The thing is also, it's very hard to find contractors to do that work. I want to backpedal a little bit. It's not only disrespect for the history, it's also how difficult it is to do. It is much easier to gut an old building with all the codes for electric, for all the, plumbing, all that energy efficiency. in the codes in South do not have the provision for preservation. And most of the people I knew who carpenters or contractors who were interested or loved preservation moved away or retired. That's a big part of the problem, or let alone finding the materials.
They rather just, I mean, they'll bring in outside work and then also just use material that won't even fit in with.
Yeah. I used, the way I restored my house was that I used a lot of salvaged materials, which you could find. There were still places where you find old planks of barn wood, also, and restored those, but that's not around, and it's very difficult to find. I mean, now you have all these PVC elements. And then also say you want to have a shingled roof. Well, the pressure-treated cedar shingles are not the same. They fall apart. They're also treated with... I mean, there are so many caveats who make it difficult for restoration.
Definitely.
So I do not want to say that everybody who cuts this has a complete disrespect to the history. No, it's also made very complex, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. And also, do you split your time between Sag Harbor and Munich?
I used to before COVID. I had a studio in Munich, and for the longest time. And during COVID, I gave it up because I thought, who knows? I probably will never be in Europe again. I mean, it was so dire, and so all I have left is a storage space. So sadly, in all truth, I cannot afford the boat. That's unfortunately over. If I would be, I would have to do it full time. I go to Europe quite a bit, and I had artist residencies also in Ireland. And I visit once a year, or I visit as much as I can, but I cannot maintain the second place anymore. That's impossible. But you asked me before how Sag Harbor had changed since I came.
Yes.
Well, demography has changed. It's a much wealthier town, apart from, the usual suspects, the traffic and all that. A lot of beloved old places have disappeared, like the Paradise and the Caruso's flower store and the Ideal, the stationery store, many of those. At the same token, we have fantastic new assets, like the Sag Harbor Cinema.
Yes.
And the church, which was founded by Edward Gornick and Eric Fischl, who also got the ball rolling with the Sag Harbor Cinema after it burned down, and made a big contribution so it could be started to be built. And we still have the same Japanese restaurant, but it's larger. We still have the best pub on the East End, Murph's, which hasn't changed, I think, in 250 years, and hopefully never will. We have some great stores, so it's not all terrible. I don't want to be that old curmudgeon who and if we just can keep it now. And what I truly wish for is more trains. There's the question if there will ever be a ferry between Greenport and Sag Harbor. There are a lot of detractors. I personally would like it, but then you don't know whether it opens the door to cruise ships. That's the latest on what we heard, rumors of cruise ships coming to Sag Harbor. That would be...
That almost seems...
Well, inevitable, or...
Yeah, but I guess you never... With someone, they would be willing to do that, but it just seems...
No, it's already on some brochures with one of these fleets. They advertise it already. They don't have the permits or anything. But
that's separate from the boat that would go from here to just Greenport and back. That
has not gone through. There was an experiment for one summer, and apparently it wasn't lucrative, and it comes up every summer. But now, the luxury cruises, that's a totally different entity. And there are rumors of that. So I don't know. And if they would indeed get the permit in Sag Harbor to land, that would change our village scape completely.
Just seems over the top.
Oh, yeah.
way over the top.
You have, yeah. So we don't know. I don't know if that ever came up with Greenport. I don't know if that has been an issue.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
They were thinking, but I think this was a while ago, like maybe 20, 30 years ago, they were thinking of putting the Crosstown Ferry coming into Greenport.
Instead of Orient.
Yes.
Ooh.
But that would have been,
okay.
It never went through.
And you have, when I just came in on the ferry today, I counted, you have 5 fishing fleets.
Yes. At least 5.
That is wonderful. That's over. I cannot remember that we ever had a fishing fleet left. And what we have now are these super yachts. We have yachts in the harbor. The sailing boats are way out there. They have to have a dinghy to get in. And you have these massive, massive boats.
We get that by the Mitchell's Marina.
Oh, you do?
We get big boats. It's just over.
You have the helipad and the jet skis and and you always wonder in what water is all the where's the waste going? So these are all pressing issues.
And you mentioned the train. That's not something. When you mention the train, you're talking about just more a train service to Sag Harbor?
Oh yeah, it's probably the same here. You have, 4 trains, and they're always at the most inconvenient hours.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And that's why they're empty. So it's if we had a train to the east end, Sag Harbor used to have a train station, but I think they got rid of that already in the 20s.
Also, I was curious just about development in Germany, and if you see any similarities, or is there more focus on preservation there compared to the U.S. or where you live, or similar problems going on there?
I can only speak for southern Germany or Bavaria, because Germany is federal, so the laws are not universal. It goes from state to state. That's different. But I happen to know that, for instance, countryside in Bavaria, the villages are usually in one cluster, and you cannot just buy a couple of acres and plonk a Big Mac mansion in the middle of a field. There's no subdivision. So open land is mostly owned and used by agriculture. So, and that is actually also in Tuscany. So that is all preserved. The villages are kept together. Now, in preservation of historically important buildings, you have an institution called Deutsche Stiftung Denkmalschutz. I can't translate it, but it's basically, in short, DSD, that is countrywide, and they preserve from medieval castle to mid-century buildings in Berlin. They're very active. It is not state subsidized. A friend of mine, architect, preservationist architect, Axel Hofstadt in Munich, is the head of that Stiftung. So it's quite active, I would say. And I don't know if it's comparable, but the subdividing of land, open land, is, in my opinion, not possible in the Alpine regions.
I think with that approach, it's more of a environmentally friendly area and a smarter way of dealing with development, with not letting more sprawl out into the open and allowing bigger, like you see across the U.S. Whether people would say, well, there's more land to spread out, but it's still not the best form of development, where you could have more of a walkable city And whether that was influenced with the cars in the 50s and 40s. And
Definitely. And also the fact that there is more land. And then also you have, coming back to Tuscany, because I know that a little bit because I lived there. So these beautiful medieval villages where every American would like Luca. Well, you can't bring a car in it. I mean, you there's a big parking outside. You leave your car, and then they have shuttles. So yes, of course, it's not a big shopping town. I mean, if you need to go to a building market, you wouldn't go to Lucca. I mean, but that's how they preserve the incredibly unique and valuable medieval towns. And same for Florence. You can't go in. I mean, the cabs can go into the city or the doctors, and so but the rest is public transportation. Or there's a much better system of public transportation. That is key. Public transportation is so underdeveloped here.
I mean, I think Germany has one of the best, just in terms of railway history and their use of high-speed trains and suburban commuter rail and light rail and the subway or bond. I think they have a people or government or just more proactive with planning ahead with that instead of focusing on highways and just widening roads.
And parking.
Although
I have a surprise for you, the Deutsche Bundesbahn has completely gone down in reliability. The leading train system is Italy with the Frecciarossa.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. And second is France with the TGV. Far superior and much less expensive than the Deutsche Bundesbahn. They got totally eclipsed.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know why that is, but I know when I was now these two years in a row in Florence, you get on high-speed trains from Florence to Venice for 40 euros, and it's a fantastic system. There's one every hour. Why that is, I don't know.
But I think in terms of the country as a whole, I think Germany, I mean, if you go south of Rome, it's not as reliable.
No, that's northern Italy.
But yeah, northern Italy might work.
It has that. And of course, we have a great subway system. Again, Munich, for instance, has a fantastic subway system. But why? Because it was built in the 70s. If you go to New York, that subway system is ancient. Also, what people forget that Germany has a very young infrastructure because it was basically leveled and had to build up from scratch. That has a lot to do with it.
I mean, it wasn't nice what happened with it being leveled, but it was that at least even in Nuremberg, they tried to rebuild it in a similar character, whether the streets, they couldn't build the old town exactly the same, or, I mean, Dresden was really...
And they did a great restoration project. There is a recent project, the Frankfurter Altstadt, Old Frankfurt, that was rebuilt, which is very controversial among architects. Some think it's Disney-ish, some think it's wonderful. There have been big controversies about it. Munich was not very carefully rebuilt. People, including my father, they pretty ruthlessly added their
own.
Oh yeah. And they also tore down a lot. And they tore down a lot that wasn't necessary to. I mean, of course, the landmarks were beautifully restored. Nobody messed with them, but sort of in the minor streets and all that, definitely. Yeah.
Just because of that, I don't know about because he was educated with Bauhaus, and
because he was a modernist. Well, he wanted to build modern, and let's say it was a building where a bomb went in, and it was totally, also the structure, of course. I mean, yes, it was easier to take it down
than restore the whole.
Lovingly restore the whole thing when I mean, but this building had also massive damage. I mean,
yes,
that's not the case in Sag Harbor.
Yeah. But and then also you said with preservation, one of I forget the name of the one in was it in Munich or Berlin? I think you mentioned it.
The Stiftung für Denkmalschutz, that
I think so.
organization. Yeah.
Yes. But I don't know if I saw that in Berlin they're rebuilding almost a replica
Of the Schloss?
of the yes.
Yeah, of the Schloss, which is very controversial. So.
But it's almost just amazing how at the same time, but I can see
that was very controversial for many, many reasons, which I have to, I just remember it because there were also people saying, why do we have to give this ode to a defunct monarchy, whereas we need affordable housing.
Okay. Yes.
Sort of, or do something totally modern instead, because, that became very political and philosophical.
So that was something, some people might say, oh, that was almost too extreme, going exactly replicating something, but at the same time, it's restoring a building that was lost. But there was other problems going on in Berlin that probably could have been gone to that.
Exactly. So, every you restore history, and every history is controversial. So, this friend of mine who's the head of Preservation Society told me a story where they had an intern who said, what the hell are you actually doing here? Why don't you just level everything and start from scratch? Mm-hmm. You could do much more energy efficient, modern. You have that school of thinking, of course. That's not mine.
Yes.
It's a different school.
Yes. And going back to your artwork and shows, do you have any other exhibitions or shows planned in the future?
Before that, I wanted to congratulate Greenport to the cinema that you are going to operate.
Yes.
That was rescued. I hope very much the auditorium will follow, which is such a magnificent building. And now you have a North Fork art.
The movie theater is now the North Fork Arts Center.
It's at the North Fork. So it will not only be screening movies, but also have exhibitions.
Yes, other events.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I think they also said possibly bring in students and have some classes, continuing education classes.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Like we have at the church. Yeah, shows coming up. I will be in a couple of group shows, I think, on the East End. And hopefully another exhibition film-related at the Sag Harbor Cinema, but can't talk about it yet.
Yes.
And I have something coming up in Berlin, and that's all I know. But sometimes these things, they gel or they don't.
Yes.
And I very much want to work also on the legacy of my parents, and particularly on my mother's films, trying to restore them and screen them, that they don't get lost. That's all.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, that's a big project I want to have for the next year.
And was there anything else we wanted to discuss?
Well, like I said, I would love to see our landmark buildings in Sag Harbor, as well as here the auditorium and the Whalers Church and the Whaling Museum, which is a very tall order.
Yes.
I know.
It's something that's really important, but just it could be a long process in terms of getting money or preservation grants, but you just don't want these kind of landmark buildings to fall apart.
Yeah, and they all have issues, big issues. Yeah.
Yes. So I want to thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today, and it was great hearing your story, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, it's a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 90 with Sabina Streeter. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.